Good afternoon, my friends. This is the Grimflayer. Hope you're doing very well today, and I am here to talk to you about how best to play BGX mid-range decks in the Pioneer format in the post-ban meta. So I'm making this video, I guess it'll come out roughly a week and a half after the big quadruple axing. The huge momentous ban list change has happened where 4 separate combo deck linchpins have all been banned out of existence in the format. And so, it's only a week and a half. It's still young enough. The meta is still burgeoning. It's still fresh. So this will hopefully be useful in helping to shape your decisions and get some legs up in the early stages of the new meta. But it is also just late enough that we actually have some real significant hard data to draw conclusions from as well. So we are going to look at a wide variety of BGX lists from a wide variety of sources. I'm going to give you my thoughts on all of those. This is a donation league, if you will. It's a donation video earned by longtime Confidant tier Patreon supporter Chris. You may remember Chris from a very early, very fun donation league video called Chris Rock, and Chris is back. He actually was saying that he was interested in a little bit of Pioneer gameplay, but I said, I'm not really playing so much Pioneer right now, but I'm still very interested in the format from a theoretical perspective. What do you think about a theory video like the one I just described in the intro here? And he said, oh, absolutely, I'm down for that. So this video is for you, Chris. Thank you so much, my friend, for your support. Thank you, of course, to all other Patreon supporters, and thank you out there for watching. Now let's get right in. A quick theoretical note, my friends. There was a lot of chatter, a whole lot of chatter in the wake of these bans, the immediate wake that is, about how banning all of the combo decks is going to give mid-range decks room to breathe. And I have to say, I kind of kept my mouth shut about this one because I'm like, okay, well, experiences don't translate at a 1-to-1 ratio across formats, and I have never been that experienced in Pioneer, and certainly right now, I am out of touch with the nuances of the immediate format, right? Nevertheless, despite all of those caveats, which is why, again, I kind of kept my mouth shut about this one, that statement rang false to me. Banning combo decks gives mid-range decks room to breathe. Really? I don't agree. We're looking at the lifeblood of mid-range decks, at least black-based mid-range decks, which to me are the true mid-range decks, the card Thoughtseize. And what better, especially in a format like Pioneer, which is restricted to newer cards only, is there to police combo decks? Really, if you're policing combo decks, you need efficient, universally applicable interaction. And, a card like Force of Negation, if it existed in the format, that might definitely apply. You can also police combo decks by just being faster than them, which maybe in Pioneer is a little bit of a struggle, but certainly some decks can at least make a good effort at. But Thoughtseize is the combo policing card of choice, in my view, in Pioneer. So my thought was always, okay, I understand that the combo decks are kind of an outlier in terms of power level, or meta share, or perhaps both. Leaving that aside, just from a purely conceptual perspective, I think taking combo decks down from the top notches actually might hurt decks that rely on Thoughtseize so much, because maybe Thoughtseize is less well positioned against whatever dethrones the combo decks than it would be against the combo decks themselves. So I was and still remain skeptical that mid-range decks are suddenly now going to spread their wings. A wide variety of mid-range archetypes are going to be played. It's going to be mid-range heaven. I really don't see that, especially, again, if we're referring to classic BGX archetypes. So that's not to say that the archetype is unplayable, far from it, but it is to say that we need to be really judicious with how we build our lists. And finally, just to elaborate on what I said in the beginning, I'm sure I'll have questions, and not everybody has seen my Legacy Depths, little foray into Legacy. As you can see from the picture here, I'm a pretty busy guy, and these days, I just have more and more donation leagues to play, more and more donation videos to make. I have adopted a wider and wider variety of archetypes in Modern. All the while, my real life just keeps getting busier, so I have had to make the executive decision to focus my gameplay almost entirely on Modern, And if I am keeping a secondary format around that I want to stay in touch with in case Modern becomes unbearable for a little while, it's got to be Pauper, because number one, it's cheap to keep around, and number two, it is the most different from Modern relative to other formats I've tried and enjoyed, like Pioneer or Legacy. So just to preempt the inevitable questions, unfortunately, no, I will not be playing Pioneer anytime soon, but that should not stop us from getting into some really interesting theory. Let's begin looking at a few lists. Okay, so first up, let's take a look at a BG Rock list from aspiringspike, a very prolific streamer. He's not somebody I watch religiously, but he is somebody that every time I see him or I see a list that he designed that is kind of a fresh take or a fine take on an archetype I have familiarity with, I'm vibing with it. I'm like, okay, I really like the way he builds lists. So between his ubiquity in the queues and also that fact, I think this is a really great place to begin. So what you're looking at here is something that's really good for testing. When you see a lot of 3-ofs specifically, it is just, to me, a sign of a list that kind of has itself figured out, right? Because when you play 3 copies of a card, it usually means you want to see exactly one of them, and they can be a little bit redundant in multiples, but with 1 copy exactly at your disposal, you can usually find really good use cases for it. And a lot of the green-black rock threats exactly fit that description. Scavenging Ooze, Courser of Krufix, Murderous Rider, Tireless Tracker. All of these things, in many ways, can be too clunky to leverage, or can reach diminishing returns, or can be too redundant if you have 2 of them operational. But if you see just one is usually enough to start snowballing the game in some way, shape, or form, and as I say, to get some kind of value out of it. And that is how we should be regarding this green-black rock deck in this format. It's a deck of incremental advantages, but it's also one of some pretty decent power and some very good consistency. Moving over to the land base is nothing if not consistent. You get to leverage a little bit of utility with Castle Lochthwain. Fabled Passage, of course, is a pretty good card in a couple different ways, synergizing specifically with Fatal Push, with Courser of Krufix, and Tireless Tracker, who also synergize with one another. And also, don't forget filling up your graveyard a little bit for escape cards like Cling to Dust. So Fabled Passage, while it can be awkward in the early turns, it is definitely a card that Rock can leverage, and as always, in all formats, a 2-colored midrange deck will have the strength of its mana base overall relative to a 3-colored midrange deck. But looking back at the spells, Questing Beast is a card that Rock really, really wants, and to that end, even though it's a 4-drop, even though it doesn't get ETB value, and even though it is legendary, the big ball of stats is something that if you're on Rock, you really have to avail yourself of, in my opinion. All of the Value Town stuff is all really good if your Disruption lines up and you can, again, grind them out with incremental advantages, but sometimes you will just need to slam QB and go to town. Grimflayer is kind of the same concept, but on the lower end of the spectrum, the lower end of the curve. Very proactive, has all the graveyard synergies that we just mentioned. Liliana the Last Hope, she doesn't always just get to machine gun things down in this format. There's really not all that much toughness one, at least that I've seen when I play. Nevertheless, a good defensive card, because the aggro decks, of course, are a little bit slower, so using her to +1 shrink the opposing board, give yourself time to stabilize, is more realistic in this format than maybe my modern viewers are used to, and of course, she is good grindy value with that -2, and she's a win con with a -7. It can definitely happen. Nissa Who Shakes the World is a card that I personally never got to play in Pioneer during my heyday, such as it was, but I remember Spike on stream saying this is arguably the most powerful 5-mana planeswalker he's seen, if I'm not misremembering or misquoting. I think it was something like that. So definitely needs some sort of a top end, might as well be Nissa Who Shakes the World. Again, there's a lot of powerful things that we can accommodate. Of note in this list, and as in many other successful Rock lists, there are no Assassin's Trophies, and there are instead 4 Abrupt Decays. So ironically enough, even though we have access to Trophy, which is one of the most wide-ranging catch-all removal spells you could possibly imagine. A lot of experienced players are excluding it altogether simply because, again, we have to remember we are an incremental advantage deck. We don't have huge haymakers like Uro, huge like battle cruiser magic style cards. The closest thing we have to that, I guess, is QB and maybe Nissa Who Shakes the World, but really that is not our game. We want to be efficient. We need to be efficient. We are a resource denial deck, or at least an attrition deck, giving the opponent a free land. We should think long and hard before we include Assassin's Trophy in our list. So to that end, 4 Decay, 4 Fatal Push, these are pretty much slam dunks in a broad meta or a blind meta, I would say. Nevertheless, you do kind of see the lack of ability potentially to deal with top-end resolved threats, but I actually don't hate that, because these days, if the top-end threats resolve, more often than not, they're burying you an advantage anyway, right? You think of like Niv Mizzet, I've mentioned Uro, cards like that. Okay, if you kill those things after they've stuck, or in the case of Uro, after they've been played from hand and then subsequently escaped, you're really far behind, and then you get to give them a land with trophy on top of it anyway, right? So I think there's a lot of merit to trying to kind of narrow our focus a little bit on Rock in a way that a deck like this does, but that doesn't mean we cannot compete with cards like Uro. Cling to Dust is a card that is making steady gains in meta share in formats like Modern even. Black-based interactive decks just really want this card by and large across a wide variety of variants and archetypes, and to me, Rock is no exception. Spike here has 1 Cling to Dust and a 2nd Cling to Dust. If I were to pick up Pioneer with a list like this, I would probably start by running it as exactly as is, right? But my first instinct would be to try to find room for more copies of Cling to Dust. Moving on to the sideboard, we see 4 Duress. I'm kind of not on board with this, simply because in my experience, Duress is a card that can either whiff, even in matchups where you want to bring it in, or sometimes, even if it has a target, taking away the creature actually tends to be more impactful. In the past, I've experimented with the card Despise in the past, which can take away creatures or planeswalkers, and even if Duress has a role, to me, 4 is kind of a high number. You also will run into the, bad top deck ratio if we are siding out threats or other, ways to interact with things that are already on board in favor of a card like Duress. So again, Spike is far more experienced right now in the format than I am. I'm just offering my thoughts. If you want to vary the list up a little bit, I might look to lean a little bit more into Cling, possibly even main deck right now, and I think Duress is a great card to shave some copies of to free up room in the sideboard for whatever you need. I love Davriel Rogue Shadow Mage. I think this card is awesome. He was one of my unsung heroes when I played Pioneer, both with green-black and with mono-black aggro. I think he's still good to keep around because there are still going to be combo decks in some way, shape, or form, but he's really, really good against control. I think this card's underrated. I love this inclusion. Kalidas, Trader of Get, we all know how powerful this guy is. Definitely don't hate that. Ritual of Soot, I suppose this is kind of a necessary evil, of course. A lot of our cards are going to die to it, but that's never stopped black-based midrange from playing Damnation or maybe these days Extinction Event in a format like Modern. Elder Gargaroth is kind of M21's answer to QB, if you will. It's a big green ball of stats and ball of text. Again, this is not my favorite design. This is part of why I have not committed to Pioneer over Modern, because the new cards like this, it's like, whatever. They're kind of cool to play with. They're really miserable to play against, right? But Elder Gargaroth, a powerful one to have at our advantage, at our disposal, rather. And Garrick's Harbinger as a 3 of rounding out the sideboard. It occurs to me that you probably can't see the bottom with my screen recorder here, but this is a 4/3 hexproof from black for 3. Hexproof from black is really, really powerful, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player or planeswalker, you look at that many cards from the top of your library, and in the context of this list, you'll be tutoring a creature card, but if you're spicing in like Garrick Cursed Huntsman or something like that, you could find a Garrick planeswalker as well. So this is actually a low-key upgrade to the deck, simply because if black becomes the color to beat, we have a very on plan, because it's both efficient on rate, it can close the game by itself, And it's disruptive in a way. It's disruptive in that it has that inherent hexproof. So this card is really on plan. If black takes over, really you want to have access to this one. You want to keep it in the back pocket. Right now, I don't know exactly how true that is. I think this might be a card where maybe we leverage 1 or 2 copies and, this is all leaving your local meta aside, and maybe keep more around, keep the 3+ around, or the prospect of main decking them around for such time as fair black-based decks start really carving out big meta shares. And next we will take the briefest of glances at my Discord member JamesC's take on green-black, and we don't have a sideboard here to look at because he's waiting to see how the meta forms as it regards that. But I just want to note a couple deviations from Spike's list. It is pretty similar, but every deviation is acceptable in some context, right? So it's worth pointing these out. The first one is the land base. We have 2 copies of Hissing Quagmire, replacing 2 copies of Woodland Cemetery. Both lists have 24 lands, therefore Flood is a real issue, therefore Hissing Quagmire, a classic mid-range plan, monosync, in the form of a manland, definitely not a card to sleep on. I understand with our really traditional curve, with our lack of mana acceleration, the desire to play no tapped lands whatsoever, but Hissing Quagmire is a card that I have always found ways to leverage, one way or another. Rarely is it that much of a burden, and often it's surprisingly effective in terms of getting us that little bit more inherent value and getting over the line somehow, whether it be Death Touch, trading with an attacker, chipping in for 2, it all adds up, right? James also is playing 3 copies of Assassin's Trophy, and as I mentioned, I think there's a lot of merit conceptually to saying, okay, we are a resource denial deck, we're an attrition deck, we don't want to give them that land, especially early in the game. That said, if you find yourself consistently with Decays rotting in hand while you die to a 4 or 5 drop permanent, don't forget the Assassin's Trophy exists, and do not be afraid to play them. At the end of the day, sometimes just killing their thing and making them punish you for having something, or for having given them something to work with, even something like an untapped basic land, is going to be the way to go. I also really like what James has done here, because when we have a higher Planeswalker count, which we do here, then the downfall of Assassin's Trophy, the downside, is less relevant because the Planeswalkers are just very individually powerful. So compared to Spike's list, James has a 3rd copy of Lily the Last Hope, a single copy of Vraska Golgari Queen, which is a card that I often do not play in Modern, and in the past in Pioneer, she has also been in and out of my list, but whenever I play her, she always manages to impress me. That does not mean that we should always, slam dunk include her. She is kind of a card whose position will more naturally wax and wane with the meta than more generically includable ones like Last Hope in this format or Lily of the Veil in Modern, right? Nevertheless, again, Vraska Golgari Queen, not one to sleep on, and also a low-key combo with Hissing Quagmire, just because in a really grindy game, I've done it before myself in Pioneer on the channel. You can get Vraska up to ultimate range, and then anything connecting is GG. Hissing Quagmire is going to be able to survive board wipes and just attack for 2, and that 2 is lethal even if your opponent is at 100 life. Finally, we have to point out the one of Nissa Vital Force. This is, of course, an alternative to Nissa Who Shakes the World. It's a little bit difficult to rate them, right? They're both big 5-mana Nissas. They both are cards that are going to be really tough for the opponent to keep up with if you're able to trade resources off and then slam them. So to that end, ironically enough, the bigger a Planeswalker gets, the more it's kind of like you can play whichever one you think is better or whichever one you even like better, right? Because 5-mana Planeswalker is a 5-mana Planeswalker at the end of the day. As long as you're choosing from kind of the top of the barrel, you will be fine. And, worth noting the nuances between the two. Nissa Vital Force is a really good anti-control card, so maybe think about that if you've got a lot of control going on. But again, the other Nissa against control, very, very good too. Creature base is pretty similar, just note the trimming around the edges that needed to be done relative to Spike's list. I think the 3rd Courser is the easiest cut of everything Spike plays, so I really like that. Murderous Rider Swift End, a very powerful card in this format in my estimation. However, trimming one there, if we needed to make another cut, makes a lot of sense too, just because you cannot always afford multiple Swift Ends in the same game. And note again, Questing Beast is simply so powerful that it makes sense, despite the 4-drop, despite the legendary rule, to play the full playset. So thank you, JamesC, for sharing your list. And next up, let us add blue, and begin doing so by taking a look at the most recent Pioneer Sultai list from the great Reid Duke. So this is a Traverse the Ulvenwald deck, which means not only do we have a lot of core engine cards that kind of define Sultai in the format in many ways. Some of them are green-black core cards like Thoughtseize and Fatal Push. Others are kind of engine cards for the deck in their own right that both advance a game plan, accrue advantage, while also being beneficiaries of or enablers for a full graveyard, like Uro Titan of Nature's Wrath and Jace Vryn's Prodigy. So not only do we have all that, we also have a Traverse package. We're looking, of course, to get Delirium online. And to that end, you see, instead of leaning really heavily, like Green-Black does on cards like Tireless Tracker and Scavenging Ooze, they are just kind of one of, potentially two ofs in the case of something like Murderous Rider, Traverse targets, where if you draw them naturally, again, like I mentioned in the Rock review, you can pretty much always find a decent use case for just one of them. But if they're the best thing to target at any given time, you can go get them at your leisure with Traverse. And beyond that, you have some spicier targets. You know, Emrakul the Promised End is often a one-of in Delirium lists in the format. This one happens to be main deck for Reid. I've always agreed with that. I've seen people put it in the sideboard. I'm like, I don't know if that makes sense because Grave Hate's coming in post-side, so why not main deck it? Hey, if you're committing to the Delirium plan enough to want a card like this in your 75, to me, just main deck it, right? But just my thoughts. But Ishkana Graph Widow, this is a card that I've actually seen Reid. I suspect he has an affinity for it, and I can't blame him. It's a classic BGX value bomb that also is not just pure value generation. It does have a very BGX feel. I mean, hey, it's a sufficiently powerful card to play right along the Delirium thing. This is a new one, Atris Oracle of Half-Truths, at least relative to a lot of the other cards we just looked at. Pretty cool. Definitely blue-black flavor-wise, because it's a mini-factor fiction upon ETB on a evasive body. Very, very cool card, and a very cool archetype as a whole. Other noteworthies are Liliana Waker of the Dead. The presence of this card as a one-of is very interesting because she is definitely, like, playable in that one-of role, but it also indicates to me that the final optimal count for her in a deck like this or in other similar decks might be 0 or it might be 2+, simply because, like, she, in some ways, like Liliana of the Veil, is kind of okay in multiples simply because she's +1ing. Redundant copies can be discarded, and then it's not quite asymmetrical discard in the usual ways. Plus, you know, in general, again, +1ing is going to fuel our Delirium plan. So I think conceptually she fits the deck as a 2+ of. Will her power level and efficiency level be sufficient to qualify her for that many slots dedicated? I don't know. But the one of, to me, looks more like let's test her out rather than she is correct as a one of, no more, no less. So maybe time will tell with her. A lot of familiar instance, Heartless Act. Don't forget about this card. I think some rockers should consider playing it as well, especially if you are low on Assassin's Trophy, but you might want to be able to reach up to kill 4 or 5 drop creatures occasionally. This card's really good. This card's like good enough to see some modern play. So don't forget about Heartless Act. Probably 1 is correct in most BGX decks unless you've got a specific meta in mind. But you know, specifically because we do have options like Decay and Trophy to reach for instead, but definitely a really strong card. Then we've got Eat to Extinction, horrifying card. Look at this thing. And of course it is really nice because When you're playing a BGX color pairing, especially a non-white one, getting yourself access to an exile effect is definitely really cool. And note that Cling to Dust is not in Reid's list, so Eat to Extinction fills in the gap where Cling to Dust might otherwise be and might potentially belong. Definitely a card that you could jam into Sultai no problem, in some ways by being an exile effect. Also, looking at the top card of your library, a little card selection, potentially fueling the graveyard shenanigans as well. It's all really good. Shark Typhoon. Yeah, I mean, the card is synergistic in a couple different ways. I don't know. Maybe I'm jaded about it because I'm kind of like... Number one, don't love playing against the decks that play it in Modern, and number two, it's the goofiness of a Shark Typhoon. I like my Magic mostly to be a little bit more on the serious side, so why don't I just make note of it and not pass judgment on it, because I'm inclined naturally to dislike this card, and maybe that is unfair from a purely objective evaluation perspective. The land base, is probably about as clean as it can get, but inherently this will be a weakness of a deck like Sultai or other 3-color BGX decks. Relative to Rock, you see we have to play 6 shock lands, 8 shock lands, so the mana base is roughly twice as painful as a normal Rock one, and on top of that, you're including a couple lands that will ETB tapped in the form of Zaggoth Triome, so definitely a bit of a mess as far as the mana base goes. Now, don't get me wrong, Uro unwinds that damage conveniently very, very well, but the 3-color configuration, the splash of blue, it does come at a price. The sideboard is really interesting. The sideboard, to me, especially from a player like Reid, seeing 1 Decay and 2 Trophy in the sideboard and a Tireless Tracker, seeing such a high quantity of main deckable cards, to me says that, okay, he's kind of got half of an expected meta in mind, and the other half he wants to account for with cards that are perhaps not hateful enough, if that makes sense, to usually qualify for so many sideboard slots, but under the circumstances of exploring a new meta, you can do worse than leaving home with more catch-all removal spells, or with another just generic value card like Tracker. So I get it, but I would not expect this to be what the sideboard looks like in a month. But Cry of the Carnarium is definitely a cool one that we shouldn't forget about. You saw Ritual of Soot being definitely stronger overall out of the aspiringspike deck, but also more non-bowy. Cry of the Carnarium is going to kill a lot less in any BGX deck. We have toughness 3 inherently on some creatures, or higher, of course, and also maybe with stuff like Garruk's Harbinger, we have more toughness 3 threats entering the maybe board, or indeed the actual 75. So don't forget about Cry of the Carnarium. If you are facing down weenie decks, don't feel that you necessarily have to reach for a card like Ritual of Soot. Cry of the Carnarium has a few different advantages in the context of a deck like this. 2 Duress. This is exactly what I was saying looking at Spike's list. Again, I love Spike's list. I think he does great stuff, but trimming a couple Duress probably was correct to me there, and I like where Reid's head is at with 2. I would play 2 as well. 2 copies of Legion's End, another great utility removal to reach for. Another exile effect, which these effects do come at a premium in black-based, but as you can see, they're more and more willing to print them as time goes on, and it has X for 1 potential, gives you hand information. The card does a lot. Frankly, it does a lot of what we want to do. I suspect this is actually a little bit underplayed in BGX archetypes. Mystical Dispute is a great reason to splash blue, and a great inclusion if you are already splashing blue. We mentioned the Tracker, and in the deck tech, the brief 1-minute deck tech of that Reid went over before he started playing with this league, I'll link that video below. Reid mentioned that Leyline of the Void was kind of a luxury card, in that he doesn't know if the meta is going to demand a full playset of Leylines, but when you're not sure, you can do worse than slamming a really high upside, really powerful card, especially because if you don't know the expected meta all that well, when it's still in such flux, you're kind of shooting in the dark anyway with trying to get a really techie, perfect 15 to cover all your bases maximally, right? So when in doubt, I like kind of taking some really high risk, high reward inclusions like Leyline of the Void and combining them with some really generically like decent, but ultimately underwhelming relative to a fully min-max sideboard options like Trophy and Decay. So I hope that made sense, and I really like a lot about the list. But again, Cling to Dust is a card that it seems to me to be pretty much correct to play. Now, I could be wrong about that. The card does have a couple downsides, I guess, or it's not always a panacea. Maybe that's a better way to put it. But Cling, definitely very powerful. Maybe, though, in this dedicated Delirium build, it's just too unrealistic to escape it much. And if you're not escaping it all that much, maybe it's a little underwhelming. Not sure. Still definitely one to keep in mind. And now, my friends, it is time to access some very fresh data. We have had 2 Pioneer challenges go down in the post-ban meta, and we're looking at the first one that happened August 8th. And here is the list, and we have a sadly disappointing lack of BGX decks, with admittedly the exception of 3 Sultai Delirium lists. We will look at those, of course, but just to clarify matters a little bit, somebody was kind enough to make this easily digestible summary of archetype count, and look at that at the very top of the list, 8 copies of Niv Mizzet, a 5-color Niv, Niv to Light, whatever you want to call it. And this is what I mentioned that my skepticism was, that I mentioned near the beginning of the video. The notion that like these somewhat dirtily, or even if they're not that dirtily, like these fair interactive decks that play a good amount of 1-for-1 spells and then incrementally accrue advantage in the form of our favorite mid-range deck, BG the Rock, we're going to spread their wings and flourish in the absence of combo. Again, my argument was that, if anything, that gives us a reason to exist, because we can end the game with a hand sandwich if we're thought seizing the combo deck out of existence, right? And we can end the game with incremental advantage if the fragile, easily disrupted combo decks, I know they aren't always that way, but in theory the archetype is somewhat easily disrupted, can be disrupted by our incremental disruption. But instead, what happens is Niv to Light just, boom, takes over, and that was exactly what I was afraid of. I don't know Pioneer well enough to say, yes, I knew Niv to Light would place 8 copies in the top 32, right? But this deck is exactly what I feared would rise. I'm thinking Uro decks, and I'm thinking monstrosity value-generating piles that, yes, they do play some interaction, but they also play the big haymakers that they just kind of slam on curve, and you're just like, oh, if you're trying to 1-for-1 them, you pretty much just can't. You pretty much just can't do it and win anyway, most of the time, unless your stuff really lines up. So let's take a look at the Sultai Delirium lists, but overall, this is what we're talking about with Niv to Light at the very top, the clear front runner the first day of the challenges, and also mono green walkers. That seems like another pretty bad matchup for a traditional BGX mid-range deck, right? Okay, 4th place list is actually structurally pretty similar to the Reid Duke one we just looked at. There are, of course, a few changes. The most easily noted one is the presence of a couple interesting planeswalkers. A copy of Lily the Last Hope, again, generically very powerful. Obviously, the -2 has some really nice synergies in the deck, but also Ashiok Nightmare Muse. Low-key a very powerful card, even one that sometimes gives me trouble in Modern when I occasionally run into it. It's not that widespread, but the card's really good, especially in the context of a BGX deck where the -3 is often just a hard exile because you will have depleted the opponent's resources anyway, and the +1, like churning out 2/2s with a card like Gideon Ally of Zendikar or my current pet card, Garruk Relentless, that's definitely a very powerful incentive to those planeswalkers. Being able, and those planeswalkers, of course, 0 to make them, being able to +1 and make a 2/3 with a whenever this creature attacks or blocks triggered ability, it's actually like really powerful. The card is definitely a bit of a sleeper, or, maybe that's not fair, maybe it's appropriately rated, but either way, this is a really nice top end in just a generic sense. What else do we have here? We have some other interesting decisions. Ipnu Rivulet is another way to fill up the graveyard a little bit in the context of this traverse shell, and also we see yet more permission out of this particular deck. Disdainful Stroke, very, very interesting inclusion. I would dare say a very powerful inclusion right now if you're looking at the likes of Niv Mizzet, Bring to Light, opposing Haymakers in Sultai decks even, Disdainful Stroke being able to counter those cards on the stack rather than try to deal with them after they've resolved and their horrendous ETB value has already buried you is definitely a more winning line. So unfortunately for our donor Chris, because I know, Chris, that you mentioned to me that you were the least interested in Sultai out of all the ways to play BGX, it does seem like right now, between the blue permission, between the undeniable power of Uro, between the generically powerful position of Delirium, where the blue splash is almost required, not only for Uro, but for stuff like JVP. Unfortunately, it does, for you, unfortunately seem like Sultai is probably the clear front runner for BGX. Let's keep looking at a couple more Sultai lists. 23rd place list here, my friends, is not terribly different from either that we've looked at so far. It's got a second copy of Atris, leaning a little bit more into the mini Factor Fiction on the Menacing Body, and also opting for straight up 2 Ashiok Nightmare Muse as the sole occupants of the kind of top-end value Planeswalker slot. So, as you can see, the core of this deck has pretty much been established, at least for the moment, and the top end, or some of the payoffs, or some of the flex slots, I hope I'm giving you a variety of things to look at and to choose from. Sideboard, I believe I already mentioned Extinction Event in passing. This is definitely another potentiality here in the archetype. Definitely slightly awkward in one sense, because one of the upsides of wrathing your own board is, of course, you get value out of your graveyard in this deck. On the other hand, it could be really impactful in the mirror to be exiling the opponent's board, or at least a good portion of it. So this is something that will be meta-based, perhaps more than anything else, but we do have a pretty healthy variety of sweepers from which to choose in the format that are all black, and also negate just yet another check mark in the permission column, yet another point in favor of splashing blue. And in 30th place, we do have a bit of a deviation from the preceding 3 Sultai Traverse Delirium lists. This is still a very graveyard-oriented deck, but it has dispensed with the Traverse package, and instead it is playing, it's actually ironically even more committed in some ways to filling up the graveyard, playing 3 Grizzly Salvage alongside the typical 4 Satyr Wayfinder. Of course, Jace Vryn's Prodigy fills the Grizzly Salvage role, but Salvage, as long as it resolves, is going to start filling up your graveyard a lot, whereas Jace, you need to untap with him and it's a much slower process. Obviously, you get value out of Jace in different ways as well, so it's a little more value-oriented, but this deck here that we're looking at is committed to interacting with the opponent and filling up its own graveyard as fast as possible in the early turns, and then it is a go big Sultai deck, so we have an increased land count to accommodate that, including the now familiar 2 Zagoth Triome, which, again, the presence of this card is definitely just another reason to play Sultai. It's just a clean fit if you need a tri-land, and we obviously can't get away from 4 Uro, but 2 Scavenging Ooze, gonna have plenty of fuel between our interaction and our own graveyard if we need to do that, and a couple Murderous Rider, of course, but also Polychronos Unchained. So we are playing 2 more escape cards, and Polychronos has a very high escape cost. You have to pay 6 mana and exile 6 other cards from your graveyard, but it is a huge haymaker, make no mistake. Again, this is a go big deck. We've got a lot of very value positive threats that are going to be very hard for opposing decks to handle, and along those lines, we round out the list with 2 copies of Hydroid Krasis, which is just this monstrous value generating card that to me is kind of emblematic of a lot of the things that don't appeal to me so much. It's just this huge value value bomb. Really hard to play against, really frustrating to play against. It's a jellyfish, it's a little silly. Whatever, I'm just going old man mode, don't mind me. The card's very powerful. If you like the style of play, you should definitely play it. And full 3 copies of Nissa Who Shakes the World, so note, this is kind of similar to Questing Beast as a 4 of in the rock decks conceptually, in that, number 1, with the card being a very high curve card, and number 2 with it being legendary, you have incentives to not play 3 or 4 copies, but in the cases of the pilots and the deck builders here, they've thought the card was so good, in such a good fit, that they didn't bother hedging against that potentiality by, as we saw in other lists, playing like a Liliana of either variety, maybe 1 Liliana, 2 Nissa, or maybe playing 1 Nissa Vital Force, 2 Nissa Who Shakes the World. Nope, they're just all in on Nissa Who Shakes the World. And hey, when you're going big, it makes a lot of sense. The sideboard and the main deck, between the two, we have 3 copies of Wilt, which is pretty cool. I guess when you have a high land count, including interaction that can also cycle, even if the interaction is a little, in and of itself, not all that exciting, makes a lot of sense, and Wilt is definitely a pretty cool one, a pretty strong card overall. I think it kind of flew under a lot of people's radars, but it is a nice printing. And in the sideboard, we have another Elder Gargaroth. This card is creeping in along the edges in a lot of BGX decks right now. And then a very teched out sideboard with one of this, one of that. A lot of typical inclusions that we've already covered, but I would like to point out 1 copy of Languish. Yet another black-based sweeper that we can reach for. So know your sweepers, know what they do, know their pros and cons, and really try to maximize the efficacy of your sweeper against the broad field relative to minimizing the downsides of killing your own stuff. And now on to the second challenge, which happened a day after the first on August 9th. And if you thought the first one was depressing, this one is maybe even more so. From the BGX perspective, Niv to Light technically got taken down a peg. Now it is only joint first alongside a mono-green Planeswalkers deck, and we are down to just 1 representation, 1 lonely BGX deck in the top 32. It is another Sultai deck, so no Rock, no Jund, no Abzan in either challenge top 32 from the first 2. That doesn't mean we can't get them in there, and we'll talk a little bit more about Jund and Abzan at the conclusion of the video, but for now, it's looking a little bit grim, no pun intended. We do like to see mono black aggro back up there, making a resurgence on the second day. That's an archetype that I think is pretty cool. I, of course, have played it on the channel before. Definitely a very fun one, but besides mono black aggro and Sultai, black is a little bit underrepresented. So again, I did mention that when we looked at the new hexproof from Black Tech. Again, a good one to have around. Do we really need it so much right now? I'm not necessarily sure, but let's take a look at a couple lists from day 2. So our lone representative for BGX on this day did actually come in 4th place, a very, very nice finish, and one that has kind of innovated, riffed off of the previous list we looked at, which is the non-Delirium, non-Traverse Sultai midrange deck, and at the expense of some kind of, the Wilts and maybe another card or 2, this pilot here has added a Liliana the Last Hope and a 3rd Hydroid Krasis, just kind of increasing the raw power level, the average power level and card quality of the deck, maybe reducing consistency a little bit, reducing interaction a little bit, but definitely seems like a really strong way to play BGX right now, arguably the strongest. I don't know. It's a little hard for me to say which is more resilient to graveyard hate. Either way, we are a BGX deck. We do have ways to get there in the face of graveyard hate, plenty of them, and also plenty of ways to interact with graveyard hate. So maybe it's not important to figure out exactly which one is better, but it's not a bad thing to think about. Maybe with the sheer presence of Hydroid Krasis having a huge, generally unbeatable value bomb come down that's totally non-graveyard dependent. Maybe this deck has the edge. A little bit hard to say, though. They both have their pros and cons in the face of graveyard hate. And in the sideboard, we are seeing consistently Mystical Dispute plus another blue permission spell of choice, with, in my view, Disdainful Stroke being probably the best one. But again, much like with our Ravs, we should know which permission spells we should reach for relative to the current meta. You want to keep them all in mind. You want to be flexible with those. But right now, if I had to choose, I would say Stroke is probably the best of the rest. And Kalidas making an appearance here. So we've got a couple lower curve like rock style cards with Kalidas and Liliana the Last Hope. This is trying to bridge the gap maybe a little bit more between the early interaction and the big payoffs, right? But definitely a very, very strong card. And just like the previous days, non-Delirium, non-Traverse Sultai list, there are 2 tireless trackers on the side, which again serve to kind of bridge that gap for a mid-rangey, mid-costed, value-oriented threat. Now, very briefly, for those who haven't seen the Mono Green Walkers deck, it was one of the decks to beat in these 2 challenges. If you're going to queue into the modern leagues right now, the Pioneer leagues right now with BGX, you should know what this deck looks like and how to beat it. And if you didn't have enough incentives to play 4 Questing Beast before in your lower curve rock or BGX decks, and frankly, maybe even some of these Sultai decks should be considering the card Questing Beast. Well, you have enough incentives now if you look at this 12 Planeswalker deck. And also, look how small all of their creatures are, besides potentially Voracious Hydra, depending on how much mana they can sink to it upon casting. The point here is that Questing Beast is going to ignore all of their blockers and pressure their life total while absolutely slaughtering their Planeswalkers, and that is exactly why, despite the legendary rule awkwardness, despite it being a 4-drop, we pretty much in my opinion, have to play 3, more likely 4 copies of QB for the foreseeable future. Okay, friends, let's conclude the video by touching on Jund and Abzan, and this is my verdict, and believe me, I hope I'm wrong, and if you have a countervailing opinion, or if you have a countervailing example of a list that you have seen or that you have built, that you think, renders what I'm about to say incorrect, I would love to hear it, and again, I do hope I'm wrong, but my view right now is that it is not worth it to play traditional Jund midrange or traditional Abzan midrange when Sultai exists, when you are taking on the burden of the 3rd color, and you can do it in a variety of ways. You can do it in the 2 main ways we saw, which are the Traverse Delirium builds or the Hydroid Krasis builds, or you could even just splash blue for like Uro and sideboard permission, and maybe 1 or 2 other things in more of a rock style list. I think any of those variants, unfortunately for those of us who like to splash red or white, are going to be stronger than anything traditional Jund or traditional Abzan can offer at this time in this format. So if you want to play traditional midrange, maybe looking at some kind of Sultai variant, and you want to be really competitive, or even you can play green-black rock and still feel really good about it, because it is a real archetype, it does have legs, you are at least justifying your own existence by saying, I have the power of this 2-color mana base, it's very consistent, it's very painless, I can leverage Scavenging Ooze better than the 3-color decks, there are the upsides. For Jund and Abzan in traditional ways, I don't think the upsides are there, or at least they're not sufficient to outweigh the downsides or the power of the alternatives. However, I have found, I say found like it was some like hidden gem. This was in the 5-0 dump from just a day or 2 ago, and it is a Jund list. It is not a traditional Jund list, and in fact, for those who do ache to play traditional Jund, I think the one thing that it could probably use is more interaction. So maybe if you want to tweak around the edges, trim around the edges of the sacrifice theme a little bit, which is the lifeblood of this particular Jund deck, and add a little bit more interaction, like maybe another Thoughtseizes or 2. Obviously, your traditional green-black removal spells are most welcome, just to disrupt what the opponent's doing while you get your own engines online. I think there's a lot of room to do that in this deck, so this might be the closest we can come to modern Jund right now in the format, while still being pretty competitive. But this is a super, super intriguing list. It is, as I say, kind of based around sacrifice mechanics. You have Satyr Wayfinder, filling up the graveyard. That's a familiar sight, but it's not really how the deck lives and dies, right? We have Gilded Goose and Deathrite Shaman, so we are ramping a lot, and we have utility out of our Monodorks. We also, of course, have the Cat Cauldron combo. I'm not saying that right. The Cat Oven combo. You know it. Cauldron Familiar, Witch's Oven. Bolas's Citadel at the top end for like the biggest sacrifice payoff of all time. But a lot of sacrifice payoffs or sack outlets kind of bridging the gap between the Cat Oven combo and the top end of Bolas's Citadel. Corvald Fey Cursed King is a really interesting one of it is, of course, in the Jund colors. One of our few main deck incentives to play Jund, which is maybe another thing to examine, but we do have 4 copies of Mayhem Devil, which is a really good clock. 3/3. Getting a lot of pings for free along the course of our normal game plan. Woe Strider, this is a card that a few people asked me about even for Modern when it came out, just because it is a huge ball of text, and I happen to think it's a perfect fit in this deck. Really, really interesting, and the same also applies to Priest of Forgotten Gods. This is a card that people wondered if it could rock, if it could Jund in Modern. I would say not, but in Pioneer, in the context of this shell, it's actually super, super interesting. Even so, it is only a 2 of because it is a little conditional compared to a lot of other ways to sacrifice creatures and get value, but the upside, the ceiling, is huge. We also have 4 copies of Trail of Crumbs, which is just another really neat synergy. This is a really cool deck. It's food-based, it's sack outlet-based, and if you look at the sideboard here, of course, we have more of a red presence with hate cards or interaction cards like Dreadbore, Cindervines, Claim the Firstborn, justifying the red splash pretty fully, and also a lot of our traditional Jund interaction like 3 Fatal Push and 2 Thoughtseize. So, maybe this pilot is correct. Maybe they are supposed to have the highest density manageable of all the sacrifice outlets and payoffs game 1, and then game 2 they trim around the edges to bring in the type of interaction they need. A couple copies of Corvald also in the sideboard. I have to admit, I don't necessarily understand that one. Maybe it's just for generic grindy value. That could definitely be. If there's something beyond that I'm missing, then all the better. But this is a super, super interesting list in my view. If you have the urge to play the Jund colors, I would encourage you to give a deck like this a spin. Now, just as with Jund, unfortunately, I think there are no real competitive incentives to play Abzan that outweigh those of Sultai or even Rock in the traditional sense, but much like the list we just looked at with Jund, you can kind of play Abzan in a more specific way that's less of a classic mid-range deck, but still has some real mid-range elements to it. What we're looking at here is from the pre-ban meta, admittedly, so maybe you would change some sideboard stuff. These Damping Spheres, for example, seem a lot less necessary than they previously were, but broadly speaking, this is kind of even less of a mid-range deck than the last one we looked at, so the sideboard's going to be the sideboard, but the main deck is really just an Aristocrats deck. They're calling it Abzan Rally here, and of course it is so named for Rally the Ancestors and the similar card Return to the Ranks, but the idea here is that with cards like Zulaport, Cutthroat, Satyr, Wayfinder, and Stitcher Supplier filling up the yard, we are going to get benefits off of our creatures dying, and also be able to buy them all back with a big X-for-1 potential that works on multiple axes with these cards like Rally and Return, and you're seeing some overlap with the previous deck we looked at with cards like Priest of the Forgotten Gods, but Abzan, of course, is giving us access to these Return to the Ranks, Rally the Ancestors type cards more than anything. Definitely the big reason to play white in a deck like this, but Cruel Celebrant, a really strong aristocrat. Cartel Aristocrat, the quintessential aristocrat, some would say. Definitely another pretty powerful one. Blister Pod is an interesting inclusion here, but it actually makes a whole lot of sense. So anyway, guys, if you do have the urge to play Abzan, unfortunately, I cannot recommend you a Siege Rhino deck right now. Actually, if you do want to play Siege Rhino, you should play 5-color Niv Mizzet. I hate to say it. I wish that deck wasn't a thing. I wish Abzan Rhinos was a thing, but that is not the world in which we live. I do not want to give you false hope. But again, if you think you've got a great Abzan list, please do share it. I will definitely be happy to see it, and I hope somebody can take it and run with it to a great result. Okay, guys, so in conclusion, I'm just going to kind of slowly scroll through the current metagame such as it is. With imperfect data, with a fresh meta, it's going to be of limited use, but it gives you some other things to have on your radar. Stuff we didn't talk about, like Spirits, which is a deck that's kind of low-key, had some pretty decent results and looks pretty promising. But as we scroll through this, just to retread what I've already said just to wrap up. My advice to you, the prospective or current BGX player and pioneer, is number one, to play some kind of Sultai variant. We have seen the Traverse decks do really well and look really strong. We've seen the go big versions with Hydroid Crisis do really well. And also, I think there is kind of an underappreciated niche right now, or not even maybe so much of a niche, just like a really powerful way to build mid-range, where we're looking at more of a rock style base, like an aspiring spike style rock base that happens to splash blue to get cards like Uro and some permission in there. And for a modern corollary to that, see my Earl Gari video. I believe that an Earl Gari style archetype in modern is also underexplored and underappreciated, just like it is here in Pioneer. So my advice would be to do one of those three ways to play Sultai, or to play good old rock, and I think there are still some real incentives to do that, especially if aggro decks start taking up to police 5-color Niv, and maybe to police the mono-green Planeswalker deck if they're able to do that. Then green-black rock, again, lacking Uro, but also has a lot of really natural efficiency against decks like that. If you must play Jund or Abzan, sadly, I must advise you away from traditional versions of those right now, but I did give you some pretty interesting avenues, I think, to explore with the Jund Sacrifice or Jund Food archetype and the Abzan Rally archetype. So as always, guys, my takes could be wrong. They could be incorrect. I would look forward, as always, to hearing your thoughts in the description below. Chris, this one was for you, my friend. I hope it was useful. I hope it was entertaining. A lot of people love the theory videos in their own rights. It's just kind of nice sometimes to hear somebody talk about our favorite game. So there we go, guys. I hope this was useful. I hope it was entertaining. And I hope to see BGX decks of all flavors putting Niv Mizzet, putting the mono-green ramp Planeswalker-style decks, putting them all back in their place in the very near future. Again, I do not plan, and I do not anticipate having the ability even to realistically play Pioneer in the near future, but I will be watching the format with interest. I look forward to seeing some of you at the top tables and doing well and hearing about your results and experiences. So thank you so much for watching, my friends. Good luck out there. Please hit subscribe if you have not already done so. If you appreciate this content, give it a thumbs up, leave a comment for the algorithm, and thank you very much once again to Chris and to all other Patreon supporters. I will talk to you guys next time. Hope everybody out there has a wonderful day.